Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, now Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome to Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
Thank you for having me.
Less a briefing, more a media question. All eyes on Rafah, the AI-generated post that's been shared by 50 million people on Instagram. Dua Lipa, Lewis Hamilton, Gigi and Bella Hadid, maybe motor racing drivers, actors and singers, but useful idiots in the modern world. How has coverage come down to this?
Well, the truth, according to the saying, a lie travels the world twice around before the truth gets its pants on. And it took Israel, in form of the IDF, about a day and a half, almost 2 days, before the IDF presented its findings and tried to shed some light on what had happened. But for most people around the world, in this day and age, when perceptions are shaped by the speed that it takes to scroll up and down the feed, that was too late. And what we have is a very serious situation where the perception was that Israel killed civilians in the humanitarian zone while it struck a military target in Rafah. What actually happened probably was that the IDF struck two Hamas terrorists who were busy directing terrorist activity against Israeli civilians in Judea and Samaria from Gaza. They struck them with small bombs, not heavy bombs, not 2,000 pounds, but really just a few dozens of pounds of bombs, each one of them. And then something happened which we don't yet know for certain. What probably happened was that either a rocket launcher or some kind of weapon storage facility that belonged to Hamas caught fire, and then the fire spread into the civilian area, the humanitarian area, and Palestinians were killed. I do not know how many. I do not trust the information coming out from Hamas-controlled Gaza as to how many, as I don't trust videos coming out of Hamas-controlled news outlets. I do not trust the lies spewed out on Al Jazeera and on many other news networks. And, for me, and maybe the listeners remember, there was an incident in, I think it was mid-October or early November, where Israel was blamed for striking a hospital and killing 500 internally displaced Palestinians. Then it took Israel only a few hours, and then Israel was able to actually say that, no, we didn't strike the hospital. It was a stray Islamic Jihad rocket that had been fired and then misfired and exploded on the parking lot and killed Palestinians. But it's the same dynamics here at play. Hamas claims something and pushes very graphic visuals out to the world. People cannot resist and think with their guts instead of with their heads, are persuaded by graphic images that go for the feelings, and then perceptions are canonized. And according to what many people understand, millions around the world, Israel did something bad and civilian Palestinians were killed, when in fact that was not the case. And it's sad, it's regrettable. It's sad that people were killed, that civilians who weren't supposed to be killed were killed. That's always sad. And it's sad that, like the saying goes, one of the first casualties of war is truth. And here, Hamas again shows its prowess at using social media manipulation, useful idiots, lazy editors and journalists, and a lot of other people who are collectively responsible for this in spreading lies, falsehood about Israel, and people believe it, sadly.
And of course, what it's doing is in other parts of the world, in the diaspora, it's destabilizing society, relationships between Muslims and Jews, which are okay in pluralistic societies, are being eroded in terms of trust. When someone perhaps who is a Muslim working with a Jewish person posts this all eyes on Rafah graphic, that Jewish person, that Muslim person faces each other the next day. It's a terrible moment, really, not just in Israel, but also around the world for every Jewish person in the United States, Canada, Britain, Belgium, Sweden, wherever it is in the Western world, there's a
France.
predominantly
Yeah.
Jewish population.
Yeah, and I would say that it's even worse because this type of this type of lies and falsehoods, we've seen it in the past that they also can be used in order to generate mass rallies and riots and attempts to lynch or hurt or kill Israelis. We saw that in the El Ahli hospital incident, where mass protests erupted in a dozen or so Arab cities around the world, and also in London and Paris and many other Western cities. They were responding to the gruesome images coming out and the headlines carried by the BBC and the New York Times, which basically took Hamas propaganda and pasted it across their screens as if it was true. And until Israel was able to confirm that it actually wasn't Israel, that damage was already done. And just fortunately, nobody was lynched or murdered or attacked during these riots around the world. But that could have been totally different. So it's not only animosity between two workers who may see this and have an awkward silence at the coffee station on work, but really it can become and it can fuel, and I think it does fuel, anti-Semitism and violence towards Jews around the world.
And as if to establish a sort of emboldenment of the Palestinian side, the Ayatollah's sick-making X feed, he's busy, or at least some of his acolytes are busy. He's tweeting every couple of hours, and some of them have been really specifically anti-Semitic tropes about Jews running the media. He is emboldened. He's talking about Syria. He's talking about the recent Arab League meeting, that some countries are better than others at basically tormenting Israel. And this is going around the world, and I don't think Elon Musk is doing much about this particular account.
No, not he and not his administrators. And I think it's really odd because that account has called for the attacks on Israel. It glorifies terrorism. It calls for the genocide of Jews, and it openly threats the state of Israel and many other more severe things, which I think very clearly violate the community guidelines of even a very, how shall we say, loosely monitored X under Elon Musk. But what I think is even worse is the fact that Iran still has this level of impunity, that they feel that they can talk, say, and do whatever they want, and that there is no price to be paid, that Jewish blood is cheap, and that Iranian puppeteers can sit in Tehran and send their proxy organizations, be it Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, or Yemenites, or any other Middle Eastern ethnicity, and do their ugly and dirty work for them. And Israel has not yet seen it fit to hold Iran accountable for these attacks against Israel. And I think that's something that needs to change. I think that the Iranian regime should have far less time on its hand plotting attacks against Israel, and it should have to focus much more energy, assets, and time on the stability of its own regime. And unfortunately, that is not yet reality. I hope that will be reality. And the moment that the Iranian regime will be destabilized and fall, will be a great moment of peace, stability, and prosperity for the entire Middle East.
We must hope for that, sir. Now, Iran really, as you mentioned, has Israel where it wants us, both in terms of the propaganda war, in terms of the actual physical war with its proxies north and east and south and southeast as well. We're in this cycle of a kind of forever war. Jonathan, with 150,000 rockets facing Israel south of the Litani River in Hezbollah, one of the biggest threats that is escalating in the north to Lebanon. How do we, sir, how do we change this if we want to get out of this perpetual state of war?
Well, we have to divide that, I think, into two levels. I think on the local, closer level, Israel will unfortunately have to deal with Hezbollah the way that it deals with Hamas. Currently, I don't see a diplomatic way out of it. I do not see Hezbollah standing down. I do not see them backing up. And I have not seen any meaningful diplomatic activity by Americans, British, French, or anybody else in order to facilitate that without having to use force. Now, we're talking about Israeli civilians that have been forced out of their homes. This is what it's about in Israel. It's about a terrorist organization, Hezbollah, firing anti-tank missiles at Israeli civilian homes, rendering them unsafe. And as such, Israeli civilians, about 100,000 of them, have been evacuated and are still out of their homes. Now, the way for that to change is for Hezbollah to be pushed away from the border and deterred or otherwise convinced not to continue with their attacks. Problem here being that they're a well-funded and powerful military organization, and I'm sure that they won't go away easily. On the bigger level, if we zoom out and do a maybe 30,000 or even 100,000 feet kind of overview, things in the Middle East will only change significantly once Iran is forced to stop puppeteering and using its proxy organizations against Israel and Western targets. Until that happens, we will have more instability, more violence, whether it's from the Houthis, who are 2,000 kilometers away from Israel, or Gaza, or Lebanon, or Syria, or even Jordan. It doesn't matter. The bigger picture is, as long as the Iranian regime has the ability, time, resources, money to do what they're doing, I think they will continue. And it's up to Israel, the West, the US, to change that reality for the sake of Israelis, but also for the sake of stability in the Middle East.
And possibly the wider world. Iran has enough material for, we're told, 13 nuclear bombs. They don't have the bomb yet. Jonathan, how many minutes to midnight are we in Israel and the Western world?
That is very difficult to say, and I've heard many assessments over the years, and I don't understand enough in terms of nuclear science to be able to say that. But what I will say is that Iran is clearly very committed to achieving nuclear military capabilities. And so far, the West isn't committed to stopping Iran from achieving those capabilities, and Iran is advancing. And I think that we have to move the discussion away from enriched materials. That used to be the talking point, but now the Iranians have surpassed that, and they have enough enriched material in order to build many bombs. So that isn't an indicator of threshold capabilities anymore. That's not the case. Now we have to look for and understand detonator capabilities and missile technology capabilities, and perhaps a few of the things that are related to combining things together. But the shorter answer is that nobody knows how many minutes to midnight we are. But I do not want to live in a reality where Iran both has proxy organizations and a nuclear umbrella above them. That would be an extremely dangerous situation for the entire Middle East.
As we look at the war in Gaza, it's the longest in the history of the State of Israel. And one metric could say that this has been a very successful urban campaign, and Hamas have their last stand in Rafah, however painful and long and much suffering there has been amongst the Israeli people and the IDF along the way. But there's another metric which isn't quite as positive, which is that the Islamists are, in a sense, winning another metric of this war by denying the right of Israelis to live in peace in the most extreme geographies of the sovereign state. 80,000 displaced Israelis in the north of the country, the egg basket of Israel, and in the south, the fruit and vegetable basket, the orchards of Israel, etc. And until Israelis can have that confidence that, hey, yeah, let's go back, and this could be months, it could be years, or God forbid, it might be never. The Islamists will be looking at that and saying, "Look, here we have dissolved the length of Israel to this thing." These are deeply worrying issues for Israel in existential terms, aren't they?
They are, and they can be clearly resolved by defeating the enemies and doing it in a very decisive way. That is how humans have conducted warfare over millennia, if not more than that. Two groups fight, one wins, the other is defeated, and the group that wins sets the terms for the future until the other group becomes strong enough again to try to renegotiate. If Israel allows what you said, that very dark and sinister future to become reality, of course, that's a strategic defeat for Israel. It cannot be allowed to happen, and Israel will not allow it. And I think that in the south, Israel is moving closer towards achieving its strategic goals of dismantling Hamas from its military capabilities. It is progressing, not very fast, but it's progressing. And the faster operations continue in Rafah, then the faster the demise of Hamas will be. But as we said before, the real challenge, the biggest challenge, is the situation up north, which is far more complex and where the stakes are higher. But the baseline and the absolute, the condition here is very clear. Israel cannot and will not jeopardize even a single square inch of its sovereign territory. That cannot be done. And it must be reclaimed and defended and protected in such a way with deterrence against a defeated enemy that it's safe for Israeli civilians to go back to their homes. They have to go back to Misgav Am, which is a kibbutz on the northern border, just on the border with Lebanon, very exposed. But Misgav Am has existed since 1948, and they need to go back to their homes. And so do kibbutz Nachal Oz, just 700 yards from the Gaza Strip. They need to go back to their homes, rebuild that beautiful community that was ravished by Palestinian terrorists and Palestinian civilians also. And that needs to be rebuilt, and then that will be the victory for Israel.
Of course, it was a founding dream of David Ben-Gurion to say that Israel can't be Israel unless it has built its clinics, its nurseries, its environments, as you say, literally yards from the most extreme borders of Israel. And now we have, I think, the diplomatic tragedy of Ireland and Norway and Spain recognizing a Palestinian state. They've joined Bulgaria and Cyprus, the Czechs, Hungary, Poland, and Romania have already done so in Europe. And I'm asking whether it points to an erosion, a weakness amongst the West, led by the Biden administration's rather confusing dealings with Israel in the last year.
Yeah, you can read it many ways. First of all, it's a prize for Hamas and for extremism. It is signs of weakness in the West. I see it as collective betrayals of democracies, of a fellow democracy, Israel, probably mostly by petty politicians in various countries who are trying to curry favor with local voters. I was amazed traveling across the English countryside to see a poster, part of the election campaigns in local elections in Britain. Usually local elections, to the best of my understanding, they're about education and roads and infrastructure and quality of living, taking out the garbage and those kinds of things. And what I saw, the tagline of the poster was that this was about Gaza. The politician was speaking about that he was going to stand strong with Gaza, and that was his main selling point in local elections in England. Which I think is absolutely absurd. There is no link between local elections in any country and the situation in Gaza, and it's absurd that it takes that kind of so much attention. And it's sad. I think the situation also indicates Israel's weak diplomatic standing and how ineffectively this government is managing affairs. I think it is amateur hour, to be blunt, and I'm saddened by it because it influences Israel in a very big and strategic way. And I agree with you with your assessment. Any perceived differences of opinion between Washington and Jerusalem are perceived by the world as an authorization to attack Israel. When America stands strongly and squarely behind Israel and supports Israel in its fight for freedom, for independence, for self-defense, usually others don't mess around. When that isn't the case in terms of perceptions, then we see other outcomes. And on the contrary, when the situation is good between the U.S. and Israel, that also promotes peace and stability. The Abraham Accords were fostered through strength and through a very strong bond between Israel and the U.S. And that led to the first peace agreements written in the Middle East for the last, I think, 40 years. And hopefully we can go back to good, strong relations between Israel and the U.S. And I think that will have an aura effect on most of Israel's other relations.
Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, thank you very much indeed for joining us right here on Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
Thank you, Johnny.